All right, time for us to get started. Good to have everybody with us today. Appreciate our guests being with us. We are studying the book of Genesis in here. Our theme this year is celebrating the seasons of faith. We started the year with winter, which January is, and we looked at the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. Now we're into the spring quarter, and we're talking about how the Bible begins. So we're looking at the book of Genesis. Of course, Genesis is a massive book. There's no way we can go through let alone verse by verse, but even chapter by chapter. We're just really going to the front section of the book of Genesis and pulling out some themes. So today we're going to be in Genesis 5 and 6. Genesis 5 and Genesis 6. We were out of outlines. I printed a few more back there, so if you not get one, you want an outline, there will be some in the back. We will refer to that quite a bit and look at some things here. But in Genesis 5 and 6, we begin in chapter 5 with the genealogy, starting with Adam, and we'll talk about several unique things in that. And then chapter 6 leads up to the flood. And Lord willing, next week we will talk about Genesis 7 and 8 and the flood. We'll see if it rains next Sunday. I don't know. It's always interesting to talk about floods when it rains, but we'll be talking about those events there. So let's read the first 4 verses here, Genesis chapter 5, kind of set the stage here, and then to go through this. You know, there are several places in our Bible where we find lists of names. And most of them are 12-cylinder names. We have a hard time pronouncing them. You don't find a Fred or a Tom. They're always long names that nobody has ever heard of today. And a lot of times we just think it's just kind of like filler. You know, it's just like, I'm getting lessons out of this. And so this is really the first major list in our Bible of names. And there are lessons here, and that's why I want us to look at this. So it begins in verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Again, that's a repeat from what he said in chapter 1 and 2. He created them male and female. Now, for generations, that was just a statement. In our culture today, this is a major statement, okay? God didn't leave it up to them. Which one do you want to be? God created them a certain way. And he blessed them and named them, man in the day when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. In the days of Adam, after he became the father of Seth, were 800 years, and he had other sons and other daughters. Now let's begin with this thought. Why are genealogies important? Seems like when you're young, I remember when I was in my 20s and my 30s and even my 40s, you know, my dad was always connected to the past. I'm like, who cares? I never know those people, never met them. But now where I'm at now, I'm into genealogy somewhat. I want to trace that. Why is that important? Why is genealogy important? Bloodline, okay. What else? Where you come from, okay. How you got here. Just about every family has a horse thief in it somewhere. Just about every family has somebody who's done something noble in their family, okay. That's just families. Several years ago, because my dad was never, his goal in life, and he completed that goal in life, was to leave this planet without ever touching a computer. That way. So he was not a laptop guy. So he'd have all these handwritten notes just everywhere. And so one year for Christmas, I put it all together and made this big genealogy diagram of our family, okay? Direct descendants, okay? And I was looking at that yesterday when I was going through this one more time. I could go back 12 generations on that thing. Johann Schaus in Saxony, Germany was born 400 years ago. 1625. When we come here to Genesis chapter 5, we're going to cover 10 generations, over 1,000 years. That's interesting to me. Just interesting that contrast as you think about that. So let's just kind of highlight some points here as we think about this. It begins with Adam. It's going to end with Noah. Now, what we see here is God is going to go through in this list here. Now, remember, Adam had Cain, Abel, Seth, and as we just read a while ago in verse 4, he has other children. So as we go through this list, we're seeing it's going through one son. Okay? Now, to think that each one of these people only had one son, that's not likely. They likely had many sons. Very obviously, it could well have been the firstborn son, but not always. Seth was not the firstborn son. And so it's going to trace it through one son as we look at this. There are, as I said, 10 generations listed here. In Luke chapter 3, you remember Matthew has a genealogy of Jesus, and Luke has a genealogy of Jesus. Luke's genealogy goes with Adam, but before that it starts with God, and then Adam. And so between Adam and Jesus, if I counted correctly, there were 77 generations. Now, in this list in Genesis 5, 6 of them live in their 900s. One lived to be 895. And so that's just, those numbers are just beyond us. I mean, we know somebody's 100 and we think they're just as old as Moses. But you think about someone's 200 years old, 300 years old, 500 years old. I mean, we're talking older than this country was a big majority of these people here, okay? So let's look at this chart. Now, this chart's kind of hard to understand, and I didn't know how to do it, so I just did it this way. So, first of all, when we're talking about BC time period, before Jesus, before Christ, the numbers go from big to small, okay? So what I mean by that is when we get down to books like the book of Malachi, those last books of the Old Testament, we're dealing with a time period of about 300, 400 BC. AD, we go up. So this is 2025. Next year will be 2026. The numbers get bigger on AD side. But on the BC side, they go down. Does that make sense? Okay, confused already, right? Okay, so we don't know when creation was, okay? At the very bottom of this gray box here, there was a bishop, Bishop Ussher, and that for years and years was the standard number. We have found out since that time he had a lot of calculation problems, okay? So his is not real accurate. But he calculated creation being around the year 4000, okay? So that would be year one in his thinking, 4,000. Then we're going to go down. And then we're on the AD side, we go up, okay? So if we just said the first year of creation was year one, I'm just using that, year one. So Adam lived from year 1 to year 930, okay? Now again, technically it's probably year 4,000 to whatever, but I'm just using that number. So Seth lived about 130 to 1042, and all down to all these numbers here, okay? And so from that, we estimate that the flood was about the year 1656 BC. That's, again, a lot of this estimate. One of the things you notice in these names, these 10 names are listed here, you don't find any of the endings connected to God. For instance, Ezekiel, I-E-L. Daniel, I-E-L. Those are little sayings that are connected to God. Isaiah, the I-A-H at the end. Those are terminologies connected with God. In these names, we don't see any of that. And that may speak well of why we had the flood. It's just the people were getting farther and farther away from God. Now, in this little box within the box, Adam's age, although 930 years old, was likely more than that. Now, what I mean by that is the day 1 or day 6 of creation when he was made, he was not a newborn baby. Okay? He wasn't in diapers, crying. Okay? God told him to name the animals. We had to have some intelligence, did he? God told him to cultivate the garden. So Adam may have started off being 30 years old. He may start off being 60 years old. I don't know. So, we say he's 930 years old by earth days. Yes, he was. But he might have had an older age than that. And that's just kind of what that is all about with that. So, having said that, what else is on this list I want to see here? You'll notice also as you scan chapter 5, starting with verse 5, you see it in 8, 11, 14, 17, 20, 27, they all died. They all died. The only exception to this is going to be Enoch. and we'll talk about him in a minute. But all of these names here, they all died. And again, that's something that we need to take heart here. Now, some observations here, okay? This illustrates being fruitful and filling the earth. That was a command back in the first days of creation, was to be fruitful, multiply, replenish, or fill the earth. And this is an illustration of this. We're getting generations of people here. And next week, Lord willing, when we talk about the flood, we're going to talk about how populated the earth might have been. Okay, and that's an impressive number. Adam, according to this list, lived to see everyone born but Noah. Now, I don't know if he actually was in the same spot to see all these people, but age-wise, he would have been around to see all these people born except Noah. Lamech, the father of Noah, died before Methuselah, his father. The son died before the father, which is kind of interesting. Methuselah died in the year of the flood. Now, some people make the conjecture that he died in the flood. We don't know. The Bible doesn't say that. But he would have likely died the same year of the flood. Whether he was in the flood or not, we don't know. Of all these names, only two of them are found in Hebrews 11, and that's Noah and that's Enoch. And we'll talk about Enoch here in just a minute. And Lamech, I believe, saw Noah as a fulfillment of some of God's promise. Down here in verse 29 of Genesis 5, it says, Lamech had a son. Now he called his name Noah, saying, "This one will give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands arising from the ground, which the Lord has cursed." It goes all the way back to Genesis 3. So it seems like somehow Lamech thought that Noah was a savior or was going to break that curse promise, fulfill some things there. That's why he named him what he did. And I don't know where he would have got that from, but that's just kind of some thoughts on that. Now some lessons we learn from this. You see this at the bottom of that chart. First of all, people face death. This was a consequence of Adam's sin. Hebrews 9, verse 27 says, "Appoint a man to die once." And we see this. God was keeping his promise that, because of their sin, man would die, and that came about from that. Second lesson we learn is that most are forgotten. That's not just true there, that's true of every generation. I mean, there are certain heroes, there are certain politicians, there are certain famous people that are remembered from every generation. But by and large, most people are forgotten. And so over in Acts 13, somebody read verse 36 for me. Acts 13, verse 36. Okay, David served the purpose of God in his generation. That's what we do. We can't go back to the last generation. We can leave some footprints for the next generation, but who we serve is this generation. Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes would make that comment, how the dead are forgotten. That seems kind of cold and kind of empty, but we impact the people we're around, and that's it. And, like that genealogy I was talking about at the very beginning, I can go back 12 generations, but I can't tell you anything about those people. I mean, if you show me a picture, which they didn't have photographs, but a photograph of Johann Schaus from Saxony, Germany in 1625, you put him with about 5 other pictures, which one was your ancestor? I don't know. And so we serve God now. And that kind of reminds us of that. And then Enoch is remarkable. He is brought out here to us in verse 21 and 22. Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years, and after he became the father of Methuselah, he had other sons and daughters. Again, are just not listed here. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. In other words, he didn't see death. Okay? Who else did that happen to in our Bible? Elijah. The only two people that never really saw death. Now, there's some things I want to pull out of this real quickly here. Enoch preached the judgment of God. Turn with me to near the end of your New Testament. It's the book of Jude. Jude chapter, well, there's only one chapter, but verse 14, verse 15. And Enoch's name was brought up. Now, this is kind of a troubling passage for a lot of scholars. They just don't know what to do with this thing. And let's read it, and we'll talk about it. Jude 14, verse 15, it says, "It was also about these men that Enoch, in the seventh generation from Adam," if you stop there and go back to your chart, count down, starting with Adam, count down 7, you're going to come to Enoch. Okay, Enoch was seventh generation from Adam. "Prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, to convict all the ungodly of their ungodly deeds, which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." Now, between Old Testament and New Testament, there were several books written that are not inspired. And during that time period, there's a book called the Book of Enoch. Not written by this guy, but just out there. A lot of scholars think that Jude is pulling out from there. My problem with this is, why does he identify him as seventh from Adam? And the second thing comes up, you don't read about this ever taking place in the Old Testament. We're not real sure why he's talking about here. When did God bring down? God told some of these early preachers, and that's something they knew. But from this, he's preaching, he's prophesying. And we also notice that Enoch lived a righteous life. He walked with God, and then in Hebrews 11, verse 5, as he's brought up there, it again refers to him as being a righteous or godly man. And in Hebrews 11:5, "By faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. He was not found because God took him up, for he attained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God." Now, later on, when we talk next week about Noah some more, we're going to see that Noah was one that also walked with God. So what we have here is, as Moses is writing this, and that's who writes the book of Genesis, he's telling us these stories, and he's telling us to Israel before they go to the promised land, and it's just kind of a reminder. How did we get here? Who is before us? We know about Adam, the first man, but how do we get down here to Moses? And so he traces this down and kind of puts this in before them so they would understand these things here. Now, before we flip the page of chapter 6, thoughts, questions, comments? Anything on this? A lot of names. But again, this common theme. Okay? This one had a son. That son had a son. That son had a son. And there's kind of a direct line being drawn here. That's what we're talking about. And there's a lot of branches coming out, but we're not following those branches. We're just going down through the direct line here. And leading to Noah, which I think is what this is so about. We're going to spend 3 chapters, really 4 chapters about Noah. And so from Genesis 6 to Genesis 9, Noah takes a big part of this Old Testament. Noah, and then Abraham and Joseph. Those are the 3 main people here we're going to read about in Genesis. And so how do we get to Noah? This is how we get there. Okay? Any thoughts? Okay, chapter 6. Chapter 6. Chapter 6, this will be second page of your outline. It's going to bring up several interesting thoughts here, and we're going to talk about what leads up to the flood. And the leading up to the flood was man's complete departure from God. And it so upset God that God was just going to start all over. Had it not been for Noah, there'd been everybody wiped out. And so that's kind of what leads up to. Let's begin with the first 4 verses. Genesis 6, first 4 verses. Talks about 2 or 3 things that's important to us. It says, "Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the Son of God came to the daughters of men, and they were born children to them. These were mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Okay, got two things there we got to kind of talk about. First of all, we got to talk about this sons of God marrying the daughters of men. Okay, common thought from this is that the daughters of men were daughters, like we have, but the sons of God were angels. That's a common thought today. And so the idea is that angels came down, had sexual relations, and that's what's taking place. Now, I want to show you a couple things here. First of all, go with me to the book of Jude. We were in Jude a while ago, but let's go earlier in Jude. Jude verse 6. This is one of the places where this is kind of used to talk about this. I've got several friends who hold this idea. Jude verse 6, it says, angels, Jude 6, angels who did not keep their proper domain, but abandoned their proper abode, is kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. So the idea from this passage is that angels left heaven, came down to earth, saw these beautiful, beautiful women, and had sexual relations with them. Okay, now let's go back to Genesis 6, because that's kind of how it's presented, but people leave out a few details here. I want you to notice the details. Details matter. Okay? Verse 2, the sons of God, now we're not saying yet what that is, but I'll tell you in a minute. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. They took wives for themselves, whoever they chose. And then in verse 4, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. So I want you to understand, the way this is written, it's not like angels came down, had sex with women, and went back up to heaven. They came down and they married. They had families. Stayed here. That just throws up all kinds of red flags, doesn't it? Okay? Now, if it's not angels, smarty pants, what is it? Let's go back to chapter 4 of Genesis. Let's go back to chapter 4 and look at the last verse. Here we start reading about Seth. To Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. I think what we have here is two strands taking place. I think we have a righteous strand and an unrighteous strand. I think we have a strand that is following God. That would be, as we think about here in Genesis 6, this would be the sons of God. They're walking with God. Enoch's going to be one of them. Noah's going to be one of them. These are sons of God, and are seeing the daughters of men. The other strand we're going to see here, coming out here real quickly, is an ungodly, a worldly strand. This is why God's going to destroy the earth. And so they saw that, and they married, and they had children. Okay? Now, the other passage I wanted to show with you, and this is why I really think this, turn over to the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 22. Matthew 22. And you might not agree with this, and that's fine. That's fine. I mean, that's why we study our Bibles and look at things and try to do the best we can. But in Matthew 22 and in verse 30, we go to let's go back up here let's go back up here to verse 25. This is the Sadducees, and remember the Sadducees were a group of the Jews, and they did not believe in spirits. They did not believe in any book of the Bible outside of the first 5. They accepted the first 5 books of the Bible. They didn't accept the rest of them. Did not believe in resurrections. Did not believe in spirits. We call them materialists. They are just here. So what happens when you die? You're like a goldfish. You're dead. That's it. That's just what they believe. So they come up with this hypothetical. Here was this woman, and she's married to a Jewish man, and they had no sons. According to Jewish law, if he died, without having, or he died, and without any sons, she could marry his brother. So she did. No sons. Next brother, no sons. She marries all 7 brothers. There's no sons. And I've often thought, I think it's her cooking. I mean, how's all 7 of these guys die and she's still alive? I don't know about that, okay? But, okay, so that's the background. So in verse 25 of Matthew 22, now there are 7 brothers with us, and the first married and died, having no children, left his wife to his brother. Also came the second, the third, down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman died. In the resurrection, I understand they don't believe in resurrections. So this is a loaded question. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For they all had married her. So is she going to be married to all 7 of them in heaven? Jesus answered and said to them, you are mistaken, not understanding the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in their resurrection they neither marry nor are given into marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. What's that mean? Angels don't marry. But you think maybe Jesus would, somebody say, well, wait a minute. Do you remember Genesis 6, Jesus? Oh, yeah, that was one exception. No, he doesn't say that, do they? Angels don't marry. Angels don't die. Angels are not like us. They're spirits. So having said all that, when I see Genesis 6, I see righteous people marrying unrighteous people. That's how I see that, okay? And I think that's going to lead to some more of those things that's going to come out just a little bit later on. Okay? Thoughts? Welcome to disagree. Add more? Yes, sir. Yeah. But that just gets into all kinds of logistic things, okay? First of all, angels are spirits. They have to take on the human form, okay? We're talking about plurality of them doing it. They have to get married. And then how can that produce children? Okay? I mean, you're getting to me, a lot of fuzziness here in my mind. Maybe they had that power, maybe they didn't. But I think what flows next in Genesis 6 is going to be something that kind of leads up to, what happened to this bloodline of Seth that was following God? What happened to Enoch and his bloodline that was walking with God? Well, those seem to be more the exceptions than the rule here. And what we're finding is man just gets farther and farther away from God to the point where God says, no more. And I think that's kind of part of that. Now, in verse 4, we read about the Nephilim. And the common thought of Nephilim, first of all, some think that is the children born of that relationship. The context doesn't say that. Context doesn't allow us to say that the sons of God and the daughters of men got married and they had Nephilim. Nephilim is independent of that. Most common thought is that these are giants. That came from the King James Version, which came from, I think, a mistranslation of the Greek. The Old Testament was Hebrew, then went to Greek, and there were some language jumps there. And so some people think this is a bloodline of giants, okay? One of the definitions of Nephilim is the fallen ones. And so, again, they were well known because that's what verse 4 says. They were men of old, men of renown. But again, I think it just flows because of the very next verse. Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man. And what we're seeing here is just, why did God do the flood? How did it start with one man in paradise, perfection? Nothing was wrong. There's nothing for Noah or Adam to complain about. Everything was perfect. How does it go from that to God saying, I'm killing everybody? Here's how. People were walking away from God. And here's a whole group of people that did that. And they're going to come up again later on in your Old Testaments, but that seems to be that concept. And so then what happens is, as we think about this, let's go through and notice what it says here. In verse 5, it talks about the wickedness of man was great. Now again, just think of the contrast. At the end of Genesis 1, at the end of creation, God saw everything and it was very good. That's how Genesis 1 ends. Everything is very good. Now we're just maybe 1,000 years later, and God sees things and there's not anything good. What's happened? So the wickedness of man was great. Also verse 5, every thought was evil continually. Go with me to the book of Proverbs, if you will. Let's just grab a couple of Proverbs on this. Proverbs chapter 6, and then also verse 15. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16 says, there are 6 things which the Lord hates, 7 are abomination to him: haughty eyes, lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to mischief, false witness who utter lies, one who spreads strife among his brothers. Verse 18, the heart that devises wicked plans. We call that premeditated. You thought about doing wrong. You planned to do wrong. Every thought was evil continually. Then in chapter 15 of Proverbs, he again mentions this in verse 26. He says, evil plans are abomination to the Lord. So what happened? Wickedness was great. Every thought was evil continually. Verse 11 says the earth was filled with violence, and flesh had corrupted their way, verse 12 says. And so over here on the side, it just reminds us that sin begins internally. Sin affects others, and sin doesn't improve on its own. It doesn't just get better. And so from this, we are introduced to Noah. Noah's kind of the savior in this sense, not of their sins, but of the human race. And again, it's going to bring out several things to this. Let's go to the book of 1 Peter, chapter 3. 1 Peter, chapter 3. And again, all throughout our Bibles, we read about Noah. And next week, as we talk more details about the flood, we'll talk about how significant that is. But in 1 Peter 3, beginning verse 18, he says, for Christ also died for sins once for all, just as the just for the unjust, so he might bring us to God, having put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he also went and made proclamation to spirits now in prison, who once were disobedient, with the patience of God, kept waiting in the days of Noah, during the construction of the ark, in which few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt of the flesh, but an appeal to God for good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so Noah, in verse 8 of chapter 6, found favor in the eyes of God. Verse 9 calls him a righteous man. He was blameless, verse 9, and he walked with God in verse 9. Now, you can only imagine how difficult that would have been. I mean, just look in this room right here. What if right here, in this room right now, this was the totality of Christians on the planet in 2025? It'd be tough, wouldn't it? But we'd still have each other. Imagine there's no one outside your family. Every single person outside your immediate family, your sons and their wives, full of violence, thinking evil continually, ungodly, not walking with God. Every single person. Can you imagine how difficult that would be? And you can imagine how discouraging that would be. And so Noah was found right with God. And so God tells Noah to build the ark. We'll go into a lot of details about that. Verse 21, he's to gather food for his family and the animals. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5 tells us that while he's building the ark, he's preaching. He's called a preacher of righteousness. So Noah is preaching. And in verse 22 of chapter 6, and also verse 5 of chapter 7, says that Noah did all that God commanded. Those of us that grew up hearing old lessons about authority, this is one of those places we'd go to. That Noah did all that God commanded. Build the ark out of gopher wood. Didn't tell him make a metal boat. Didn't make it out of pine or oak or anything else. He did what God said. And that's what's significant. And so in verse 18 of chapter 6, God makes a covenant with Noah. This is established by God. This is an eternal covenant, and it's built upon grace. And that's what saves Noah, is the grace of God through his faith. We'll read next time about Hebrews 11. By faith, Noah, by faith. That's the key component there, that he was one who did things by faith. Here in Matthew 24, this passage on your outline here, Jesus brings up Noah several times. And here in Matthew 24 it says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until that day when Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be." What's that tell you about Noah's preaching? What's that tell you about that? They didn't listen, did they? Didn't think it was going to happen. Very, very strong chance that it had never rained on the earth up to that time. From the days of the garden, it talks about how God would create a dew to water things. So Noah's talking about rain, and they probably don't even know what rain is. He's building an ark not near any body of water. They might think, well, how are you going to get this big old boat over to where the water's at? You're a long way away. Just lots of things. They would have mocked him, made fun of him, but by faith, he kept doing what God wanted him to do. Okay, so thoughts, questions? Okay, we'll stop for now, and next week, 7 and 8. Yes, sir. And what's the answer to that? Okay.